My badge stopped working at 11:42 in the morning. On the same day, 200 employees were eating sheet cake under a banner that read 40 years of Whitmore family strong. I found that out the hard way, standing at a side door with my hand still on the handle, looking through the glass at a party I had spent 3 weeks organizing. My father stood at a microphone 40 feet away, the same microphone I'd tested twice that morning to check the sound levels. He pointed at me with the hand he'd used to teach me how to balance a checkbook when I was 12 years old. He fired me in front of every person who had ever called me boss. But here's the detail that took me 6 months to understand. My badge had been deactivated at 9:15 that morning, 2 hours before he said a single word into that microphone. Someone had known before I did. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I was the chief financial officer of Whitmore Industrial Supply for 9 years. This is the story of the day my father called me a thief in front of 200 people. And the 6 months it took me to prove, with paper, with dates, and with a stranger's tip, that the only person stealing anything was standing right next to him. I grew up in Kessler, Indiana, in a brick ranch house 4 blocks from the first Whitmore warehouse, a cinder block building with a tin roof that my father bought with a loan his own father co-signed in 1984. Russell Whitmore started with one truck, a handshake deal with 2 machine shops, and a wife who did the books at the kitchen table after she put the kids to bed. That wife was my mother, Carol. She kept those ledgers for 11 years before the company could afford to hire anyone else. I used to sit on the floor under that table and watch her pencil move down the columns. I didn't understand the numbers yet. I understood that the numbers mattered more than almost anything else in that house. By the time I was in high school, Whitmore Industrial Supply had grown into a real distributor: bearings, fasteners, hydraulic fittings, the unglamorous parts that keep factories running. We weren't rich the way people in movies are rich. We were the kind of comfortable where the cars were paid off and the vacations were modest, and every dollar had a job before it arrived. My brother Brandon was born when I was 11. I remember holding him in the hospital and thinking he looked like a small, furious king. That turned out to be accurate in ways I couldn't have predicted. Brandon was easy to love the way certain children are easy to love: loud, funny, quick with a compliment, the kind of kid who got away with things because he made the room laugh before anyone noticed what he'd done. I was the other kind: quiet, exact, the one who double-checked the math on my own report card before I brought it home. I went to Purdue for accounting, then Indiana University for an MBA, then 6 years at a regional accounting firm under a partner named Frank Doyle, a man who wore the same brown cardigan every winter and once made me redo an audit 3 times because I'd rounded a number instead of tracing it to the source document. Eleanor, he told me once, standing over my shoulder while I cried quietly into a stack of invoices, a rounded number is a number somebody's hiding something behind. You find the real one or you don't sign your name to it. I never forgot that. I want you to remember it too, because it matters later. My father called me when I was 28. He needed a controller. The company had grown past what a part-time bookkeeper and a tired office manager could handle, and he didn't trust an outsider with the numbers the way he trusted blood. I left a firm where I was on track for partner and went home to Kessler for less money and the promise that I'd eventually run the finance side of the family business. I want to be honest about something. I didn't go back because I needed the job. I went back because some part of me still wanted to sit under that kitchen table and watch the pencil move down the page. Except now I'd be the one holding it. I became chief financial officer at 31. By then, Whitmore Industrial Supply had 3 distribution centers, a fleet of leased trucks, and just over 200 employees on the payroll. We'd taken on an outside investor 8 years before I took the CFO title, a private equity group called Crestview Capital Partners, who bought 30% of the company to fund the third warehouse. That deal came with 2 seats on a real board of directors, not just a family table anymore. My father stayed chairman and majority owner. But for the first time in the company's history, there were people in the room who didn't have to agree with him. I bring that up now because almost nobody remembered it mattered. It mattered more than anything else in this story. Brandon joined the company at 25 after two failed attempts at other jobs. A sales role he was let go from after 8 months, and a marketing position he quit before they could let him go from that one too. My father gave him the title of VP of Business Development, which in practice meant golf with vendors, dinners with clients, and a corner office he decorated with photos of himself shaking hands with men twice his age. I ran the numbers. Brandon ran the room. My father loved us both, but he understood Brandon. He never fully understood me. And I think that's because I reminded him too much of my mother, the woman whose ledgers built the company, and who he stopped consulting the moment he could afford not to. For 9 years, I did the job the way Frank Doyle taught me. I traced numbers to source documents. I caught a freight overcharge in my third year that saved us $400,000 over the life of the contract. I restructured our line of credit with Meridian Regional Bank and dropped our interest rate by 1.5 points. I built the financial model that got us our second and third distribution centers approved by the board. Nobody threw a party for any of it. My father said, "Good numbers," the way other fathers say, "Good game." A pat on the shoulder that cost him nothing and meant the conversation was over. I'm telling you all of this so you understand what was actually true on the morning of April the 11th, when 200 people gathered in the main warehouse to celebrate 40 years of a company I had quietly kept solvent for nearly a decade. The anniversary event had been my idea, if I'm being honest with you, which I intend to be for the rest of this. 40 years felt like something worth marking, and our employees worked hard, and I wanted them to feel like the milestone belonged to them too, not just to the family whose name was on the building. I booked the caterer. I ordered the banner. I built the slideshow of old photographs, the cinderblock warehouse, the first delivery truck, my mother at that kitchen table with the pencil in her hand. I had no idea I was building my own going away party. Looking back, there were signs, small ones, the kind you only see clearly once you know what you're looking for. 3 weeks before the anniversary, Brandon started asking for access to financial reports he'd never cared about before. Freight cost summaries, vendor payment schedules, things squarely in my department and not his. I gave it to him because he was my brother, and because refusing felt petty over numbers he had every right to see as an executive of the company. 2 weeks before, my father asked me to walk him through our largest freight vendor contracts in unusual detail, line by line, more carefully than he'd ever asked before. I remember thinking he was just being diligent ahead of our annual board meeting, which was scheduled for the week after the anniversary event. I didn't think to ask him why now, after 9 years of never once asking. 1 week before, Hollis Reed, our operations manager at the Kessler Distribution Center, a man who'd been loading trucks for this company since before I could drive, stopped me in the hallway and asked, almost offhand, whether we'd changed freight carriers without telling the warehouse floor. I told him I'd look into it. I didn't, not that week. I had a 40-year anniversary party to run. The morning of the 11th, I arrived at 6:30 to check on the caterer setup. Folding tables draped in white cloth ran the length of the main warehouse floor, cleared of pallets for the occasion. A banner stretched across the steel beams overhead. 40 years of Whitmore family strong. The letters 2 feet tall, blue on white. The same blue as our delivery trucks. By 10 o'clock, the warehouse floor held 200 people. Employees from all three distribution centers bussed in for the day, plus a dozen vendors, a reporter from the Kessler Courier, and 3 members of our board, including Patricia Lindgren, the Crestview Capital director who almost never came to anything that wasn't a quarterly meeting. My father gave a speech about the cinderblock building and the first handshake deal. He thanked the warehouse crews. He thanked Brandon for, in his words, bringing energy and relationships this company needed. He did not thank me. which by then I had stopped expecting, though some small, stubborn part of me still noticed. At 11:30, the caterer began serving cake. I was near the side door, checking my phone for a vendor confirmation, when I noticed my screen showing a system alert from our building access software. Badge deactivated. Eleanor Whitmore. 9:15 a.m. I assumed it was a glitch. I had walked through that exact door at 6:30 with no problem. I made a mental note to call IT after the party and went to find my husband, who was standing near the back with a paper plate of cake he hadn't touched, watching the room the way he watches a job site before he signs off on it, carefully, for things that don't look right. My husband, Owen, owns a commercial construction company, Pure Structural. He builds warehouses and office parks for a living, the kind of work that leaves calluses and a habit of noticing load-bearing problems before anyone else in the room does. We'd been married 6 years. He had never once pretended to enjoy a Whitmore family event, but he came to every single one, because that's the kind of man he is. "Something's off," he said quietly, before I could tell him about the badge. I didn't have time to ask him what he meant. My father stepped back up to the microphone. "One more thing before we cut the cake," Russell Whitmore said, and the room settled the way a room settles when a man who built it asks for quiet. I remember the next part the way you remember a car accident, in pieces, out of order, too vivid and too fast at the same time. He said there had been irregularities in our freight and logistics spending discovered during preparation for the upcoming board meeting. He said an internal review had found unauthorized cost overruns totaling more than $1 million over 18 months. He said the review had been conducted under his direct oversight, with Brandon's help, and that as chief financial officer, the responsibility for those numbers sat with one person. He looked at me when he said my name. Effective immediately, Eleanor is no longer with this company. 200 people turned to look at me at the same moment. I have done a lot of public speaking in my career, board presentations, bank negotiations, vendor disputes in rooms full of lawyers. I have never in my life felt as exposed as I did standing by a folding table of half-eaten sheet cake while my father called me a name he never actually said out loud, because he didn't have to. Everyone in that room understood exactly what unauthorized cost overruns meant when paired with my title and my removal in the same sentence. I want to tell you I said something composed and devastating in that moment, the kind of line you'd remember for years. I didn't. I stood there with my badge already deactivated in my pocket, in a building I had kept financially alive for 9 years, and I said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that 200 witnesses hadn't already decided for themselves. Brandon stood beside our father, hands folded, his face arranged into something that was trying very hard to look like grief and mostly looked like relief. Hollis Reed, near the front of the crowd, did not clap when a few uncertain people did. He looked at me, then at the floor. The way a man looks when he already suspects he's watching the wrong person get blamed, and doesn't yet have proof to say so. Owen put his hand flat against my back, not pulling me anywhere, just letting me know he was there. "We're leaving," he said. "Now." I walked out the side door I'd been standing near all morning, the one my badge no longer opened, so Owen had to hold it for me. Behind us, I heard the caterer ask, in a voice too cheerful for the moment, whether anyone still wanted cake. A cardboard box was waiting for me in the parking lot by the time I got there, which told me someone, Brandon, I assumed, had packed my office that morning before the party even started. My laptop, my framed CPA license, a photo of my mother at the kitchen table, the one I kept on my desk to remind myself why I did this job carefully. I sat in the passenger seat of Owen's truck in the Whitmore Industrial Supply parking lot, holding a box that contained 9 years of my professional life, and I did not cry. I want to be precise about that, because I think people expect crying, and what I actually felt was colder than that. I felt like a column that didn't reconcile. Somewhere in my father's $1 million number, There was an error, and I knew exactly the kind of person who finds errors for a living. What do you want to do? Owen asked. The same question he always asks me when something breaks. Instead of telling me how to feel about it, I want to see the file, I said. The internal review he mentioned. I want to see who built it. I never got to see it. Not that week. Not that month. I called our general counsel, a careful man named Philip Esposito, who told me, not unkindly, that the company had legal grounds to terminate me without sharing the underlying review, and that any further requests should go through an attorney. I called Patricia Lindgren, the board member, who told me the board had been briefed that morning, just before the event, on findings prepared by Brandon and reviewed by my father, and that she had voted with the rest of the board to support leadership's decision based on what she'd been shown. What were you shown exactly? I asked her. A summary, she said, not the underlying detail. I assumed that existed and that you'd had a chance to respond to it. I had never been asked to respond to anything. Nobody had shown me a single invoice, a single number, a single date. I had been fired from the inside of a story that was already finished before I walked into that warehouse at 6:30 that morning to check on a caterer's table linens. That's the part one needed people to understand, eventually. Not that I was innocent. Innocence is something you claim. I wanted to be something better than innocent. I wanted to be correct, with paper to prove it. For the first month, I did almost nothing, which for me is its own kind of statement. I am not a woman who does nothing well. Owen watched me reorganize our own household files 3 separate times, alphabetized, then by date, then by category. The way you rearrange furniture in a house you can't actually leave. You're auditing the silverware drawer, he told me one evening, not unkindly, setting a glass of water beside me at the kitchen table where I'd spread out our mortgage documents for no functional reason. Eleanor, you didn't do anything wrong. You don't have to prove that to a junk drawer. He was right, mostly. But there is a particular kind of grief that comes from being accused of carelessness by people who built their entire understanding of you on the assumption that you were careful. I needed to know what I'd actually missed, if anything, before I could let myself be angry instead of ashamed. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I rebuilt my own ledger from memory and from what records I still legally had access to. My personal tax filings, board minutes I'd kept copies of as a matter of habit. Every email I'd sent myself summarizing decisions, going back 3 years. I wasn't building a legal case yet. I was just trying to find the floor under my own feet again. What I found, in those weeks, was nothing dramatic. Just a quiet, growing list of decisions in the last 18 months that hadn't gone through me the way they should have. A change in our primary freight carrier, approved at the operations level, without a finance sign-off memo I would normally have required. An increase in expedited shipping fees that I'd flagged once in a quarterly report and been told, by my father, not to worry about because Brandon had it handled. I had let that go. I want to own that. I had let my brother handle something I should have insisted on reviewing myself, because he was my brother, and because pushing on it felt like picking a fight I didn't have the energy for that quarter. That's not a crime. But it was a door I'd left unlocked, and somebody had walked through it. In May, I started doing freelance consulting work, partly because Owen and I still had a mortgage, and partly because sitting in my own kitchen reorganizing folders was making me feel like a ghost in my own house. Frank Doyle, my old mentor, semi-retired by then, but still doing select forensic work for attorneys, called me out of nowhere and asked if I wanted to help him on 2 cases. I heard what happened, he said, which was the only acknowledgement he ever gave it. I also know how you work. Come help me. And let's see what people pay for an honest number these days. I built a small practice out of that. Eleanor Whitmore Financial Consulting. No warehouse, no banner, just a laptop, a card table in my spare bedroom, and a growing list of small manufacturers and family businesses who needed someone to find the truth in their books without flinching. I billed by the hour. I traced everything to the source document, the way Frank had taught me 30 years before. Within 4 months, I had more client work than I could comfortably handle alone. I didn't talk about Whitmore Industrial Supply with my clients. I didn't have to. Word in Kessler travels through grocery store lines and church parking lots faster than any press release, and most people already had an opinion about what had happened to me before I said a word. My mother called twice in those months. The first call she spent talking about Brandon's promotion to Chief Operating Officer, announced 2 weeks after my termination, as if I might want to hear about my replacement's career advancement. The second call, in June, she asked if I was doing all right financially, the way you ask a stranger if they need directions. Polite and entirely beside the point. "I'm doing fine, Mom," I told her. "I'd be doing better if anyone had shown me the file before they decided I stole from my own family's company." She didn't have an answer for that. She rarely did, with anything that required taking a side. The clue that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in July, 4 months after the anniversary party, in the form of a phone call from Renee Castillo. Renee and I had known each other for almost 15 years. She was a loan officer at Meridian Regional Bank, the bank that held Whitmore Industrial Supply's primary line of credit, and we'd bowled on the same Thursday night league for most of a decade before our schedules pulled us in different directions. She called me that afternoon not as a banker, but as a friend who sounded careful in a way I recognized immediately, because it's the same careful voice I use myself when I found something I'm not yet sure how to say out loud. "I probably shouldn't be calling you about this," she said, "but I keep thinking about it, and I'd rather tell you something a little wrong than say nothing and be right." She told me the bank had recently completed its annual credit review of Whitmore Industrial Supply ahead of a renewal decision on their line of credit, and that the freight and logistics expense line had grown almost 40% over 18 months, far outside what the bank's underwriters considered normal for a company of that size and growth rate. She told me the review had flagged a single vendor, a logistics company called Voss Logistics Solutions, as responsible for the majority of that increase. "I don't know anything about what happened with you and your father," Renee said. "I'm not calling to take a side. I'm calling because that vendor name didn't exist anywhere in your company's records before about 2 years ago, and I know you. If there's a number that doesn't add up, you're the only person I trust to look at it honestly, whatever it turns out to mean for your family." I want to tell you I felt vindicated in that moment. What I actually felt was quieter and colder than that. The particular stillness of a person who has just been handed the first real threat of something they'd suspected but couldn't yet prove. I thanked her. I told her I'd look into it, on my own time, as a private citizen with no current relationship to the company. She reminded me, gently, that anything I found needed to go through proper channels, not back to her, and not into the rumor mill that ran through Kessler faster than anything official ever could. That evening, I told Owen about the call over dinner, a casserole he'd made, because cooking was the thing he did with his hands when he was worried about me and didn't know what else to offer. "Voss Logistics," he repeated. "Never heard of them on any job site. And we use freight vendors too." "Neither had I said. And I built every freight contract that company had for the better part of 9 years. That night, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table for the first time in months with something other than dread. I am a forensic accountant by training and temperament. I had spent 4 months treating my own termination like a wound to manage. It was time to start treating it like a file to open. The first thing I did was call Hollis Reed. Hollis had worked at the Kessler Distribution Center for 27 years, longer than I'd been alive when he started. He'd asked me about a freight carrier change back in March, a question I'd been too busy with party planning to follow up on properly. I called him on a Wednesday evening, at home, not at the warehouse, because I didn't want this conversation logged on any company line. "I wondered if you'd ever call," he said, before I'd finished explaining why I was calling. "I've been waiting on it, if I'm honest." He told me that sometime in the fall before my termination, Whitmore Industrial Supply had quietly shifted the majority of its outbound freight business from our two longtime carriers to a new company, Boss Logistics Solutions. A switch, he said, came down from Brandon's office with no warning to the warehouse floor and no transition plan, which is unusual for a logistics operation that size. Used to be, any carrier change went through finance first, Hollis said. I figured you'd signed off on it somewhere along the way. But the trucks that started showing up weren't even the same fleet size as what we needed. We were paying for capacity we never used. I mentioned it to your dad once. He said Brandon had it handled. There was that phrase again. Brandon had it handled. I'd heard it from my father in a quarterly meeting 18 months earlier about the same subject, and I'd let it go because pushing harder felt like picking a fight over something that wasn't, on its face, dramatic enough to justify the cost to my relationship with my brother. I should have pushed harder. I want to say that plainly because this story doesn't work if I pretend I was perfect. I wasn't. I was tired of being the person who always pushed, and I let a small unlocked door stay unlocked for 18 months because I was choosing peace with my family over diligence in my job. That choice, more than anything Brandon did, is the part one still sit with. One more thing, Hollis said, before we hung up. That Voss fellow. He came by the warehouse twice, early on, before any of the paperwork went through. Drove a truck with Kentucky plates. Different name on the door than what ended up on the invoices. I only remember because I wrote it down on a delivery log out of habit. Force Logistics Group, it said, not Voss. I asked him to find that log if he still had access to it. He said he'd see what he could do, carefully, and that he wasn't going to risk his pension doing anything that looked like he was stealing company property to hand to me. I told him I understood completely, and that all I needed, for now, was a name to search. The next morning, I went to the county recorder's office and then to the Indiana Secretary of State's business search portal. The same kind of public records anyone is allowed to pull. The same kind of search I'd done 100 times for client engagements and never once for my own family. Voss Logistics Solutions, LLC, registered 14 months earlier in Indiana. Registered agent and sole listed officer, Marcus Voss. Business address: a mailbox rental storefront in a strip mall off Route 9. The kind of address that exists to receive mail, not to run trucks out of. I sat in my car in that strip mall parking lot and stared at the listing for a long time. A real logistics company has a yard. It has dispatchers. It has a real door you can knock on. Voss Logistics Solutions had a mail slot. I widened my search the way Frank Doyle had trained me to, looking for what came before. Men who build shell companies are rarely first-time builders. They dissolve one and walk into the next. I searched business filings in neighboring states under variations of the name Hollis had given me, and I found it within an hour. Force Logistics Group, LLC, registered in Kentucky 4 years earlier, dissolved 2 years after that, following 2 unresolved complaints filed with the Kentucky Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, both alleging inflated freight invoices and undelivered service guarantees to small manufacturing clients. The officer listed on that dissolved company was a man named Marcus T. Vossler. Same first name, same middle initial pattern. A birth date listed on an old filing that matched, almost to the day. A birth date I found attached to Marcus Voss's current Indiana business license. A man does not usually shorten his own last name by one syllable for no reason. People change names for 100 honest reasons. But a man who changes his name, crosses a state line, and opens a mailbox instead of a yard, right around the time he starts handling freight contracts for a company run by an inexperienced, image-conscious young executive, is not running from a messy divorce. He's running a route he's run before. I called Frank Doyle that afternoon, not because I needed his expertise exactly, but because I needed to hear another forensic accountant tell me I wasn't building a conspiracy out of coincidence. Pull the bank wire records if you can get them legally, he said. Everything else is smoke. Wires are the only thing that doesn't lie. I didn't have legal access to Whitmore Industrial Supply's bank records anymore. But Renee Castillo, careful and clear about the lines she would and wouldn't cross, agreed to tell me one more thing, off the record, as a friend and not as my source. She confirmed that Voss Logistics Solutions had received payments from Whitmore Industrial Supply totaling just over $1.1 million across 18 months, and that a portion of those funds, smaller, recurring, monthly, had been wired back out of the Voss Logistics account to a separate LLC called BW Consulting Group. I didn't recognize that name either. Not at first. It took me less than 10 minutes with the Secretary of State's portal to find that BW Consulting Group had been registered 18 months earlier, around the exact time the freight increases began, by an officer named Brandon Whitmore. My brother had a shell company. My brother's shell company had been receiving a percentage of every inflated invoice Voss Logistics Solutions billed to the family business. My brother had stood at a microphone in April and told 200 people that the missing money was my fault. I sat with that for a long time before I told anyone, even Owen. Not because I doubted it, because once you know something like that about your own family, you can't unknow it, and I wanted to be sure I was about to do the right thing with it, not the satisfying thing. There was one more piece I needed, the piece that would matter most in a room full of people who'd want to believe their eyes more than my evidence. I needed proof that the responsibility my father had assigned to me in front of those 200 employees didn't actually belong to me. I requested my own archive calendar and travel records from the previous 18 months, the kind of thing any reasonable person keeps for tax and reimbursement purposes. I cross-referenced them against the dates on the largest Voss Logistics invoice approvals, which Renee had been able to confirm only as dates and amounts, nothing more, strictly within what she could ethically share. 3 of the largest invoice approvals, the ones used to build the case against me, were logged under my digital approval credentials on dates I was demonstrably elsewhere. One was approved on a day I was at a logistics and supply chain conference in Columbus, 200 miles away, with a hotel receipt, a conference registration badge, and a dinner credit card charge from a restaurant a mile from that hotel to prove it. Another was approved on a date I was in a deposition prep meeting with our own outside counsel, a meeting Philip Esposito's office had billed for and could confirm independently, since it appeared on their own invoice to the company. Someone had used my login credentials, on my own computer system, on days I was provably somewhere else, to approve the invoices that were later used as the foundation of an internal review accusing me of unauthorized spending. I had shared my password with exactly one person in 9 years, for exactly one reason: an emergency system access during a week I was recovering from minor surgery in Brandon, filling in temporarily on a handful of routine sign-offs, asked for it so finance wouldn't grind to a halt. I never changed it afterward. That, too, is a door I left unlocked. I'm not proud of it, but an unlocked door is not the same thing as a crime, and I intended to make sure everyone eventually understood the difference. By September, 5 months after the anniversary party, I had a folder. Not a metaphorical one. An actual folder. The kind with a metal clasp that I kept locked in a fireproof box in our spare bedroom closet. Inside it, the Secretary of State filings for Voss Logistics Solutions and BW Consulting Group, the dissolved Kentucky filing under the name Vossler, the wire transfer summary Renee had carefully confirmed I could describe only in general terms unless subpoenaed properly. My calendar and travel documentation proving the approval dates didn't match my whereabouts, and a written timeline I'd built the way I'd build a forensic report for any client, dated, sourced, and stripped of every adjective that wasn't strictly necessary. I did not bring that folder to my parents' house. I did not call Brandon. I did not post anything, anywhere, about any of it. Evidence that walks through the wrong door too early gets explained away by people who aren't ready to hear it. I had learned that the hard way once already. The morning $1 million number was announced to 200 people before anyone showed it to me. What I didn't know yet was that I wouldn't have to find a door to walk through. One was about to open on its own. In late September, Whitmore Industrial Supply's annual credit line renewal with Meridian Regional Bank came up for review. The same review process that had originally flagged the Voss Logistics anomaly to Renee months earlier. This time, the bank's underwriting committee, looking at a freight expense line that had continued climbing even after my termination. Despite Brandon's promises that tightening procurement would bring costs back down, declined to renew the company's full credit line without an independent forensic review of vendor spending for the prior 2 fiscal years. That decision did not stay quiet. A company that size losing access to working capital is the kind of problem that reaches a board of directors within a single business day. Patricia Lindgren, the Crestview Capital director, called an emergency board session within the week. My father, as chairman, could set the agenda, but he no longer controlled the votes the way he had when it was just family at the table. Crestview's 2 board seats, combined with one outside director my father had appointed years earlier specifically because she had a reputation for not being pushed around, formed a majority that didn't need his permission to ask hard questions. I learned all of this afterward, in pieces, the way you learn about a storm after it's already passed through your town. What I experienced directly was a phone call on the first Tuesday of October from a number I didn't recognize. Eleanor Whitmore, the voice said. This is Patricia Lindgren. I imagine you're surprised to hear from me. I told her I was listening. She told me the board, in an emergency session the previous evening, had voted to commission an independent forensic review of the company's vendor and freight spending over the prior 24 months. In direct response to the bank's findings, and that several directors, herself included, wanted that review conducted by someone with no current ties to company leadership and an unimpeachable professional reputation. Your name came up independently from 3 different people in that meeting, she said, before I even raised it myself. One of them was your bank contact, speaking through our outside counsel, without naming you specifically, just describing the kind of forensic background the board needed. One was a longtime operations manager who apparently mentioned to someone on our audit committee that the woman who used to run finance here was, in his words, the only person who ever made these numbers make sense. And one, frankly, was me, because I never forgot that I voted to remove you based on a summary I never should have accepted without underlying detail. I owe you an apology for that, whatever else this review finds. I sat down at my kitchen table while she talked, the same table where I'd rebuilt my own ledger from memory 5 months earlier, and I let myself feel, for the first time since April, something other than careful. I have a folder, I told her. I haven't shown it to anyone yet. I think you're going to want to see it before you finalize the scope of this review. The board retained me through a formal independent engagement letter drafted by their own outside counsel, not as Eleanor Whitmore, fired daughter, but as Eleanor Whitmore, CPA, principal of Eleanor Whitmore Financial Consulting, to conduct an independent forensic review of vendor spending for Whitmore Industrial Supply over the prior 2 fiscal years. My father was informed of the engagement the same day the board approved it. I was told, secondhand, that he objected loudly and was outvoted, 4-1, with Brandon, who held no formal board seat but had been invited as an observer, sitting silently through the entire session. I want to pause here and tell you what that vote actually meant, because I think it's easy to misread it as some kind of instant vindication. It wasn't. It was an opportunity, the first one I'd had in 5 months, to put my findings in front of people whose job was to evaluate evidence rather than protect a family narrative. The rest was still up to the paper. I spent the next 6 weeks doing the most careful work of my professional life. I requested, and through formal board authority received, full access to the company's financial system, every invoice, every wire confirmation, every digital approval log, with timestamps and IP addresses for the full review period. I cross-referenced every Voss Logistics Solutions invoice against actual freight capacity used at each of our 3 distribution centers. The way Hollis had first flagged to me back in March, before any of this had a name. I built a complete map of every BW Consulting Group wire transfer and matched it, dollar for dollar, against the timing of Voss Logistics invoices submitted and approved in the preceding days. I traced the 3 disputed approvals from April back to their source IP addresses and login session logs, which the company's own IT system retained for security purposes regardless of who held the password. 2 of those approvals had been logged from a desktop computer in Brandon's office, not mine, on days I was independently verified to be elsewhere. The third had been logged from a laptop registered to Brandon's company-issued device, connected through the guest network at a golf club 30 minutes outside Kessler. On an afternoon, his own expense report, filed the same week, showed him attending a client relationship lunch at that exact club. I did not allege fraud in my written report. I had learned that lesson from watching other professionals do this work properly, and from a hard conversation I once had with an attorney years earlier during an unrelated client engagement, who told me plainly that a forensic accountant's job is to lay down what's verifiable, not to render a verdict. So my report did exactly that: dates, amounts, source documents, login records, a complete corporate history of Voss Logistics Solutions and its predecessor entity, a complete corporate history of BW Consulting Group and its sole registered officer. No adjectives, no accusations, just a column of numbers that, for the first time since April, finally reconciled and pointed somewhere other than at me. I delivered the final report to the full board and to outside counsel on the second Thursday of November. The board scheduled a special meeting for the following week to review the findings with company leadership present, a meeting that, due to the number of senior managers and department heads whose attendance the board specifically required, ended up being held in the largest space the company had available for it, the main warehouse floor at the Kessler Distribution Center. The same room where I'd been fired in April, cleared of pallets for the occasion, folding chairs arranged in rows instead of around catering tables, a 40-year banner long since taken down. I want to tell you I planned that symmetry. I didn't. The board simply needed a room big enough for 200 chairs, given how many managers and department heads they'd asked to attend, and the warehouse was the only space the company had that fit. Some things just happened to land back where they started, whether or not anyone designed it that way. I walked into that warehouse on the third Wednesday of November, 6 months and 5 days after I'd walked out of it carrying a cardboard box. Owen came with me, not because anyone required it, but because he wasn't going to let me sit alone in a room where my own father had once decided not to. My father was already seated near the front, in a chair that put him at eye level with the small table set up for whoever would be presenting. Brandon sat 2 seats down from him, his collar a little tighter than I remembered, his hands folded the same way they'd been folded the day he stood beside our father and let 200 people believe a story he'd built himself. Patricia Lindgren opened the meeting from the small table at the front, explaining briefly, for the benefit of the department heads and managers who'd been asked to attend without full context, that the board had commissioned an independent forensic review of the company's vendor spending following concerns raised during the bank's credit renewal process, and that the review had been completed by an outside forensic accountant whose findings the board considered material to the company's continued operation. Eleanor Whitmore will now present her findings, she said. I want to tell you my hands were steady walking up to that small table, because that's the kind of detail people remember in stories like this. The truth is, my hands were not entirely steady. What was steady was my voice. because I had rehearsed every sentence of what I was about to say the same way I rehearse client presentations. Out loud, alone, until the facts came out smooth and the feelings stayed where they belonged, underneath. I did not say a single word about being fired. I did not look at my father when I opened my laptop. I looked at the room. The same room full of warehouse managers, regional sales staff, and department heads who'd watched me get walked out in April. And I gave them exactly what I'd give any client: the numbers, in order, dated, sourced. I showed them the freight expense trend line, climbing 40% over 18 months while shipment volume stayed essentially flat. I showed them the Secretary of State filing for Voss Logistics Solutions, registered to a mailbox address 14 months prior. I showed them the dissolved Kentucky filing for Forest Logistics Group, the consumer protection complaints attached to it, and the matching birth date that connected Marcus Voss to a man who had run this exact pattern once before, in a different state, under a different last name. I showed them BW Consulting Group, registered 18 months earlier by Brandon Whitmore, and the recurring wire transfers from Voss Logistics Solutions into that account, timed within days of each inflated invoice approval. I showed them the 3 disputed invoice approvals from April, the ones used to justify my termination, traced by login session, an IP address to a desktop in Brandon's office, and a laptop on a golf club's guest network. On dates, my own travel and meeting records, independently verifiable through outside parties, placed me somewhere else entirely. The room was very quiet by the time I reached that last slide. Not the polite quiet of an audience being patient. The other kind. The kind where 200 people are doing math in their heads and not liking where it lands. My father stood up before I'd finished speaking. His face had gone the particular gray of a man watching a number he built his life around fail to add up in front of witnesses he couldn't control. "This is your evidence," he said, "against your own brother." "This is the bank's evidence," I said, "and the Secretary of State's evidence, and your own company's login records. I just put them in order." Brandon stood up next, and for a moment I thought he might try Voss's old trick, the practiced laugh, the reach for the room. He didn't have it in him. Not in front of people who just watched 18 months of his behavior laid out as a timeline with sources attached. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," he said instead, his voice climbing in a way I'd never heard from him before, the easy charm gone entirely. "Dad kept comparing everything I did to you. Every quarter. I needed something that was mine." Voss said the structure was clean. He said it was just consulting fees for bringing in better rates. "Voss has done this before," I said, "under a different name, in a different state. There are 2 unresolved complaints on file in Kentucky describing the exact same arrangement. You weren't building something of your own, Brandon. You were the second mark in a scheme somebody else had already run once." He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody in the room did, for what felt like a very long time. It was Hollis Reed, sitting near the middle of the warehouse floor, who broke the silence, standing up the way he had every right to after 27 years on that floor. "I told finance about that carrier switch back in the spring," he said, to the room, not to me. "I told Russell directly. He said Brandon had it handled. I figured that meant somebody with authority had looked at it. Nobody ever did, except her. And by the time she looked, she was already gone." My mother, seated beside my father, had not said a single word since the meeting started. She looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like a woman doing math she didn't want to finish. Patricia Lindgren closed the formal portion of the meeting carefully, the way I imagined she'd closed difficult board sessions before, stating plainly that the board would refer the findings to outside legal counsel and, where appropriate, to law enforcement. That Brandon Whitmore was suspended effective immediately pending that review, and that Voss Logistics Solutions contract would be terminated and the matter referred for potential civil recovery action. Then she did something I hadn't expected and hadn't asked for. The board would also like to formally apologize to Eleanor Whitmore, she said, to the full room, for terminating her employment in April based on an internal summary that, as we now understand, was built on falsified approval records. The board has voted to extend an offer for Eleanor to return to Whitmore Industrial Supply as Chief Financial Officer, effective immediately, with full board confidence restored. 200 people turned to look at me again, the same way they had in April, except this time the silence in the room felt like something closer to respect than judgment. I didn't answer her in that moment. I want to be honest about that too, because I think the audience for a story like this often wants the triumphant, immediate yes, walking back through the same doors as if nothing had happened. That's not how trust actually gets rebuilt, in my experience. And it's certainly not how I run a negotiation. I told the board I would give them my answer within 2 weeks, after I'd had time to review what return would actually mean, on what terms, with what protections, and after a private conversation with my father that had nothing to do with any board vote. That conversation happened 3 days later, on the back porch of the house I grew up in. The same porch where I used to sit and watch my father survey the parking lot of his first warehouse like a man counting his kingdom. He didn't apologize the way I might have written it if I were inventing the scene instead of living through it. He sat for a long time without speaking, turning his coffee mug slowly on the armrest, before he finally said, "I should have shown you the file before I said a word to anyone else." I told myself I was protecting the company by moving fast. I was protecting myself from finding out I'd let your brother run something I never properly checked. You let him run it because checking him would have meant admitting you favored him without earning it, I said. I'm not asking you to fix that today. I'm telling you I know exactly what it cost me, in dollars and in dignity. And I expect that to matter in whatever happens next. He nodded, once, the way Hollis had described seeing him nod at a different truth months earlier. A small motion from a man not used to making them. My mother called the following week, and for the first time since this entire story began, she didn't lead with a request. "I always told myself the numbers were your job and the feelings were mine to manage," she said. "I think I let that be an excuse for not asking harder questions about either one. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I don't know what that's worth to you right now, but I wanted you to hear it before you decide anything." I told her I heard her. I didn't tell her it fixed anything, because it didn't, not yet. And I've learned not to perform forgiveness I haven't actually finished earning my way back into feeling. I accepted the board's offer, but not on the terms they'd first proposed. I didn't go back as an employee reporting to my father. I negotiated a new position entirely, Chief Financial Officer reporting directly to the board, with a formal charter giving my office independent authority over vendor approval, freight contracting, and any future related party transactions, reviewed quarterly by the full board rather than by family discretion. I kept Eleanor Whitmore Financial Consulting running alongside it, smaller now, just Frank Doyle's old caseload and 2 long-term clients I wasn't willing to walk away from. I wanted one foot permanently outside that building, on principle, so I would never again be a person whose entire professional identity could be deactivated with a single keystroke at 9:15 in the morning. Brandon was formally terminated in December, following the board's referral to outside counsel. He was not criminally charged. In the end, the civil settlement his attorneys negotiated required him to repay the funds traced through BW Consulting Group and barred him from holding any officer position at the company again. Marcus Voss was a different matter entirely. The forensic findings, combined with the prior Kentucky complaints, were referred to the Indiana Attorney General's office, and the last I heard, through Renee, who heard it through the bank's own counsel, he was facing both civil recovery action and a separate criminal inquiry into the structure of both his current and former companies. Hollis Reed got a quiet word of thanks from the board for the delivery log he'd kept all those months, the one with a different company name written on it out of nothing but a lifelong habit of paying attention. I made sure that thanks was on the record, in writing. because some debts deserve a paper trail too. I won't tell you the ending of this is a clean, warm family dinner, because that wouldn't be true. And I promised myself a long time ago, sitting at that kitchen table redoing audits for Frank Doyle, that I would not sign my name to a rounded number. My father and I talk now, carefully. The way two people talk after a structure between them has been damaged and is being rebuilt one inspected beam at a time. My mother and I are slower, and that's all right. Some things take longer than a single apology to reconcile. What I know for certain, the thing I'd want anyone in my position to hold on to, is this. I did not get my career back because someone finally felt sorry for me. I got it back because I refused to let a story stand simply because 200 people happened to be in the room when it was told the first time. The truth doesn't need an audience to be true. It just needs someone patient enough to find the paper that proves it, and steady enough to wait for the room that's finally ready to listen. I sit at the head of a different table now, in an office with a lock no one else has the combination to, looking at numbers that finally, completely reconcile. And every month, when I sign my name to the report, I think about a woman at a kitchen table with a pencil, and a partner who told me once that a rounded number is a number somebody's hiding something behind. I never round anything anymore. Not the numbers, and not what I'm willing to accept from the people who are supposed to love me enough to check their own math first.